The funeral flowers had only just begun to fade when the calls started coming in like vultures circling fresh carrion. I was standing in my kitchen on that gray Thursday morning, 3 weeks after we buried Catherine, staring at steam curling from a coffee mug I couldn't bring myself to touch. That mug, forest green ceramic with a hairline crack running down the handle, had been a Father's Day gift from my granddaughter Jessie years ago, back when her world was still small enough to fit in our backyard. Now it felt foreign in my hands, heavy with the weight of a life I no longer recognized as my own. Everything felt foreign those days. The house that Catherine and I had filled with 28 years of laughter and arguments. My reflection in the hallway mirror, gaunt and hollow-eyed like a man who'd forgotten how to sleep. Even my own voice sounded strange when I answered the relentless phone calls from my children, each ring cutting through the silence like a blade through paper. "Dad, we need to talk about the house." Trevor's voice carried that controlled impatience I'd known since he was 16 and asking for car keys. Only now, at 39, he wasn't asking. He was telling. The certainty in his tone made something cold settle in my chest. I set the mug down without drinking, watching the coffee grow cold. "Good morning to you too, Trevor." "Don't start with that." His voice sharpened. "Diana and I have been talking. This place is way too big for you alone. The property taxes, the maintenance costs, it's not realistic anymore. We've already found a buyer." The words hit me like a slap. "There's no mortgage," I said flatly, the words coming out mechanical, matter of fact. Catherine and I had paid it off 4 years ago, but I'd never mentioned it to the kids. They'd assumed we were struggling, and I'd let them believe what they wanted to believe. Silence stretched across the line, then came that short laugh, sharp, dismissive. The same one he'd inherited from me, though I'd never wielded it like a weapon. "Dad, please." His tone shifted, becoming patronizing in that way that made my jaw clench. "Mom's medical bills ate through most of your savings. We all know you're barely staying afloat." I walked to the window above the sink, looking out at the garden Catherine and I had tended together for 28 years. The rosemary bush she'd planted leaned toward the flagstone path, heavy with purple flowers. The Meyer lemon tree needed pruning. Its branches scraped against the fence whenever the wind picked up. Every plant, every carefully placed stone, had become a monument to everything I'd lost. "You're worried about me?" I asked, my voice deliberately calm. "Is that what this is?" "I'm worried about what's practical," he replied, each word clipped with barely contained frustration. "We could put the money from the sale to good use. Diana's got Jessie's college tuition to think about, and Diana and I stopped listening. My mind was already constructing the scene. Trevor at their dining room table, laptop open, a spreadsheet glowing on the screen with columns labeled "Dad's House Sale," "Price," "Proceeds," "Split." I knew the mechanics of his thinking because I'd taught him to calculate change for the ice cream truck when he was 8. Now he was calculating me. "Trevor," I said, keeping my tone level, "you've been planning this for quite some time." "That's called being responsible," he shot back. "We can't just sit around waiting until something happens to you." "Until something happens to you." The phrase hung in the air between us, ugly and unpolished, revealing more than he'd intended. "Thank you for your concern," I said, my voice as flat as the lemon tree's shadow across the stone path. "I'll think about it." "Dad, but—" I ended the call before he could turn my life into bullet points. The house settled into silence again, but it was a different kind of quiet now. No longer the stillness of grief, but the pause between one blow and the next. I rinsed the untouched coffee down the drain, my hands catching the faint scent of rosemary Catherine used to cut for Sunday roasts. She'd hand me the sprigs like small trophies. "Fresh from the source," she'd say with that smile that could still make me feel 25 years old again. The phone rang again. Diana this time. I considered ignoring it, but grief teaches you that avoidance only delays the inevitable. It doesn't stop what's coming. "Dad," she began, her voice pitched just a little too high, the tone she used when trying to make bad news sound like a gift. Trevor and I are on the same page here. You both think I should sell the house, I finished for her. She hesitated. It's for the best. You could move in with us. We've got that finished basement and a full bath. Trevor says we could add a kitchenette. You'd have your own entrance, your own space. It's perfect. Perfect. A word too big for 4 walls below ground level. And the money? I asked. Well, after we cover the contractor cost for the basement renovation, you could set some aside. Maybe help with Jesse's tuition. Help Trevor with his new business venture. It's all family, Dad. Win-win. Win-win. I could hear the rehearsed cadence, the echo of conversations they'd had without me. They'd already agreed on the ending before asking if I'd read the script. Diana, I said carefully, when was the last time you called me to talk about something other than money? That's not fair, she protested. I've been busy. Jessie's in her junior year. Work's been crazy. 2 months, I said. It's been 2 months since you called about anything else. The silence was brittle, thin as ice over a pond in March. You've been sending Jessie money every month? She blurted finally, as if it were an accusation. Yes, I said. $500 for 2 years. Another pause. She doesn't need to know that, Diana said quickly. Of course she didn't, because if Jessie knew, she might question the stories she'd been told about her grandfather, the fragile old man who couldn't manage his own affairs, who needed decisions made for him by wiser, younger minds. I need to go, I said, and hung up before the conversation could turn into something even uglier. For a long time, I just stood in the hallway, watching late morning lights slant through the front windows, catching dust motes that danced like tiny ghosts. Catherine's reading glasses were still there on the console table, folded neatly on top of a paperback she'd never finish. I reached out, then stopped. Touching them felt like crossing a threshold I wasn't ready to cross. My feet carried me without conscious thought to Catherine's study. The room still held traces of her presence, lemon oil on the wooden surfaces, the faint whisper of her perfume clinging to the curtains. Her desk was exactly as she'd left it, pen resting diagonally across a yellow legal pad, the corner of an envelope peeking out from under a stack of papers. I sat in her chair, the leather worn smooth where her elbows had rested for years. For the first time in 3 weeks, my shoulders unclenched. There was a bottom drawer on the left side of the desk, one that had always stuck from years of humidity and use. I pulled it open with some effort. Inside were the usual sediments of a life lived: old tax returns, appliance manuals, greeting cards saved for reasons only Catherine could have explained. But beneath them, my fingers found the edge of a pale blue folder. It was heavier than it looked, the papers inside shifting with a faint whisper, as if they'd been waiting for this moment. I didn't open it immediately. Instead, I set it on the desk and rested my palm on the cover, feeling the texture of the cardstock beneath my skin. A yellow sticky note was attached to the front, covered in Catherine's tidy block letters. If you're reading this, you need to know what's inside. I sat there as late morning light warmed the side of my face, and for the first time since the funeral, I felt something other than the crushing weight of loss. It wasn't hope, not yet, but it was direction. A path forward that I couldn't see clearly but could sense, like the outline of a mountain in fog. The pale blue folder sat before me like an unopened letter from the past, its secrets waiting to reshape my future. When I finally opened the folder, the first thing I saw was a sheaf of financial statements. Bank accounts I didn't recognize. Not the joint accounts we'd maintained for decades, but individual ones, all in Catherine's name. One was from a small credit union 2 counties over, another from an online bank I'd never heard her mention. Each contained modest sums, $8,400 here, $12,200 there. Not fortunes, but enough to make me wonder why they'd been kept separate, hidden. Beneath the statements were property documents that made my breath catch. The first was a deed for a cottage in Tuscany, Italy, purchased 8 years ago. The owner's name, Catherine Marie Hale. No mention of me anywhere on the paperwork. I flipped to the next page, a letter from a law firm in Florence dated just last spring, confirming the property's current value and offering to arrange rental management. Catherine had declined in a handwritten note at the bottom. Not yet. Keep quiet. Keep quiet. The words sat in my mind like a splinter. There were more documents. Life insurance policies I'd never signed, all with carefully chosen beneficiaries. I'd expected Trevor and Diana, but one policy caught my eye. A newer one, much smaller, naming only Jessie. No mention of her parents anywhere. I leaned back in Catherine's chair, the lemony scent of furniture polish suddenly overwhelming. Catherine had always been methodical, deliberate. She didn't forget things or make mistakes. If she'd kept this from me, it wasn't an oversight. It was intentional. I picked up a smaller envelope tucked into the back of the folder. Inside was a letter dated 18 months ago, written in Catherine's distinctive cursive. Richard, if you're reading this, I'm gone. And if I'm right about our children, the calls have already started. They'll circle you like sharks, not because they need you, but because they want what we've built together. I've watched it for years. The small comments, the questions about money, the way they calculate what isn't theirs yet. You've always given them the benefit of the doubt. I stopped doing that a long time ago. The house is yours. It stays yours. I paid it off so you'd never have to answer to them about it. But I also knew they'd try to convince you that you couldn't manage alone. That's why there's a second plan. The cottage in Tuscany is for you, but not officially on paper. You'll find instructions in the back. Follow them if you need to disappear for a while. Sometimes the only way to win is not to play their game. Catherine's voice was so clear in those words, I could almost hear her speaking them aloud. Calm, even-toned, not angry, but absolutely certain. I turned to the back pocket of the folder and found a typed sheet with contact information for the Florence law firm, a local caretaker named Maria, and a small brass key taped to the paper. Next to the key was a note in Catherine's hand. Trust Maria. She owes me her life. Long story. I let the papers fall to the desktop, my pulse steady, but my mind racing. Catherine had built me an escape route complete and ready to use. All these months while she was fighting cancer, while I was focused on treatments and hope and denial, she'd been quietly constructing a safety net I'd never known I'd need. For the rest of that afternoon, I moved through our house like a man walking through two different timelines. Every object I passed, the framed photo of Trevor at his high school graduation, Diana's ceramic vase from her college pottery class, Jessie's crayon drawing of our garden, felt like evidence in a case I hadn't realized I was building. In the kitchen, I found myself staring at the spice rack Catherine had arranged by height instead of alphabetically. She'd always said it looked better that way, but now I wondered how many small, deliberate choices she'd made that I'd never questioned. I poured myself a glass of water and stood at the sink, watching the late afternoon light turn our garden golden. I remembered the last conversation Catherine and I had about the kids, just before she got really sick. They love you, I'd said, irritated that she'd been distant with Trevor during his last visit. They love the version of me that helps them, she'd replied, the version that says yes to everything. I'd dismissed it at the time as one of her darker moods. Now it echoed in my mind like a warning I'd ignored. That evening, Trevor called again. I didn't answer. He left a voicemail. Dad, just think about what I said earlier. We can make this easy for everyone. Don't make it harder than it needs to be. Easy for everyone. Right. Diana texted an hour later. Coming by Saturday to talk, bringing Jessie. It'll be good to see you. The phrasing wasn't lost on me. Bringing Jessie, as if I were the guest, not the homeowner. I put the phone face down and returned to Catherine's study. The folder was still on the desk, its secret spread out like a map of a future I'd never imagined. I studied the insurance policy, naming Jessie again, noting the date, from last year, well after Catherine's diagnosis. She'd made this choice deliberately, when she knew exactly what she was doing and why. As night settled over the house, I turned on the desk lamp. its warm pool of light catching the edge of a photograph I'd missed earlier, tucked deep in the back of the folder. It was a picture of Catherine and Jesse in our garden, both wearing wide-brimmed hats, their hands dirty from planting herbs. Catherine's arm was around Jesse's shoulders, her smile wide and unguarded. On the back, Catherine had written, "Teach her how to keep what matters." I sat with that photograph for a long time, the old clock on the wall ticking away seconds with its familiar, slightly irregular rhythm. I thought about calling Jessie, telling her everything right away. But Catherine's note had said, "If you need to disappear," not, "if you need to explain." This wasn't the time to show my hand. Not yet. Near midnight, I locked the study door for the first time in years. The folder went into the bottom drawer of my own desk, not Catherine's. The key to the Tuscany cottage went into the small safe hidden behind our bookcase, the one only Catherine and I had known about. I stood there for a moment, my hand resting on the leather spines, listening to the familiar sounds of our house settling into night. Somewhere in the darkness, I could almost hear Catherine's voice. "You don't have to fight the way they expect." The next morning, I woke before dawn with a clarity I hadn't felt in months. I made coffee, actually drank it this time, and sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad. I drew 2 columns, what they know and what they don't know. The first list was surprisingly short. The second was longer than I'd expected. When the sun finally broke over our garden, I looked at the lemon tree that still needed pruning and thought about Tuscany, about Maria, whoever she was, about disappearing. Not out of fear, but on my own terms. For the first time since Catherine's funeral, I felt something sharp and clean beneath the grief. Not anger exactly, but resolve. My children thought they were dealing with a confused old man standing on the edge of a cliff, waiting to be pushed to safety. They had no idea I'd already built myself a bridge. Saturday arrived with pale winter sunlight, thin and apologetic. I'd been awake since 5, walking the garden paths in my heaviest coat, feeling frost crunch under my boots like broken promises. By 8, I'd pruned the rosemary, swept the flagstone steps, and put the kettle on. It wasn't about tidying up for them. It was about reclaiming my morning routine before they arrived to dismantle it. At 9:17, I heard tires on gravel. Trevor's black Range Rover eased up the driveway, its paint so glossy it caught the weak morning light like armor. Diana sat in the passenger seat, phone already pressed to her ear. In the back, I could see Jessie's forehead pressed against the window, her breath fogging the glass. I opened the door before they could knock. "Morning," I said, keeping my voice neutral. Jessie hopped out first, her face lighting up as she ran toward the porch. "Hi, Grandpa." She wrapped her arms around my waist, and for a moment everything else fell away. Her hair smelled like the strawberry shampoo Catherine used to buy for her visits. "Hey there, kiddo," I said, holding her just a moment longer than necessary. "Come on in. It's warmer inside." Trevor and Diana followed, bringing with them the scent of expensive coffee and cold ambition. Trevor didn't remove his sunglasses until we were in the kitchen, as if the morning light might reveal something he didn't want me to see. "You've been busy," he said, scanning the spotless counters with what might have been approval. "Place looks good." I poured tea into Catherine's favorite mugs, the heavy ceramic ones she'd insisted we use for guests. "Had time on my hands," I said simply. "Coffee?" "No," Trevor said quickly. "Yes, please," Diana countered, shooting him a look. I poured Diana a cup and watched her wrap her hands around it like an anchor. She studied the steam rising from the surface as if it might tell her what to say next. I took my seat at the kitchen table and let the chair creak in that familiar way. "You said you wanted to talk, so talk." They settled across from me, side by side like a united front. Jessie had wandered off to the living room, where I could hear her flipping through a stack of Catherine's gardening magazines. Trevor cleared his throat. "Look, Dad, we don't want to drag this out. We found a buyer. Solid offer. Actually more than the place is worth in this market. It's a chance for you to downsize without the stress of taxes and maintenance." "I told you there's no mortgage," I said again, letting repetition do its work. That's not the point, Diana interjected, leaning forward. It's about practicality. You don't need all this space anymore. You're alone here. I looked from one to the other. These children I'd raised. These adults who thought they knew me. You're worried about the house being mine? Or you're worried about me being alone? Those aren't the same worry. Trevor's jaw tightened. You think we're doing this for ourselves? I think you should answer my question, I said calmly. The silence stretched like a rubber band, broken only by the sound of Jessie giggling at something in one of the magazines. In moments like this, Catherine's voice came back to me. You don't have to fight the way they expect. So I didn't argue. I let the silence do the work for me. People hate a vacuum, they always try to fill it. Trevor was no exception. It's just, we have responsibilities, he said finally, his composure cracking slightly. The offer would let you move somewhere comfortable, maybe closer to us, and it would free up. He stopped himself, but I knew where that sentence had been headed. Free up the capital. Diana picked up the thread. We could help you find a nice condo, something manageable, close to Jessie's school. What if I'm comfortable here? I asked. That's not sustainable, Trevor said, his voice sharper now. I set my teacup down with deliberate care. Do you remember the summer you were 12, Trevor? The roof leaked over the east bedroom. I spent 2 weeks fixing it myself. You helped me lay shingles. Trevor frowned. What does that have to do with anything? Everything, I said, because this house isn't just square footage. It's work. Work I'm still capable of doing. Diana rolled her eyes just slightly. Dad, you're almost 70. You shouldn't have to. And yet I can, I said. I do. I didn't tell them about the folder in my desk, about Tuscany, about Catherine's letter. That was for later, when the time was right. Jessie wandered back in, holding a drawing she'd made with colored pencils during her last visit. I found this in Grandma's magazine, she said, showing me a picture she'd drawn of our garden. Bright green rosemary, a yellow lemon tree, and tucked in the corner, a small representation of Catherine's study with its distinctive blue curtains. It's perfect, I said, smiling at her. You remembered the color of Grandma's curtains. Jessie beamed. Of course. Grandma always told me to draw what's true. Trevor shifted uncomfortably. Jess, why don't you go explore the garden? The adults need to talk. She skipped off, and when she was gone, I leaned back in my chair. Here's the thing. Catherine wanted me in this house. She made sure I could stay here. Paid it off years ago quietly because she didn't want me hounded about it. Diana blinked. Paid it off when? 4 years ago, I said. It was a small drop of truth, just enough to shift the ground beneath them without revealing how deep the foundation went. Trevor's mouth pressed into a thin line. Why didn't you tell us before? Didn't think I needed to, I said. It was between Catherine and me. They stayed another half hour, trying to steer the conversation back to logistics and practicality, but I let their words drift past me like wind through bare branches. I asked about Jessie's school, about Diana's catering business, about Trevor's latest golf scores. Every answer was shorter than the last, their frustration mounting with each deflection. When they finally stood to leave, Trevor said, Just think about it, Dad. The buyer won't wait forever. I'll think about it, I said, walking them to the door. Jessie hugged me again at the threshold. Bye, Grandpa. I'll come visit again soon, okay? Anytime, kiddo, I said, meaning it completely. After the Range Rover rolled away, I stood in the doorway, feeling the cold air bite my cheeks. Inside, the house felt different. Not empty, but expectant, like it knew something was about to change. In Catherine's study, I opened the blue folder again and looked at the photograph of her and Jessie. Teach her how to keep what matters. I was beginning to understand that the real battle wasn't about the house at all. It was about teaching the next generation that some things are worth fighting for, and that sometimes the best fight is the one your opponent never sees coming. I picked up the phone and dialed the Florence number Catherine had left me. When a woman answered in accented English, I took a breath and said, "This is Richard Hale." Catherine was my wife. She told me to call when the time was right. There was a pause, then a warm laugh. "Ah, Signor Hale. Then I think we should meet very soon, no? I am Maria, and I have been waiting for your call." After we hung up, I sat back in Catherine's chair and felt something shift inside my chest. Not hope, exactly, but possibility. My children thought they were setting the terms of engagement, playing a game where they held all the cards. They had no idea the deck had just been reshuffled. The game was about to change, and this time, I would be the one dealing. Maria's voice lingered in my ear long after we hung up, warm and musical in a way that made the transatlantic connection feel like a conversation between neighbors. I stood at the kitchen window, phone still in my hand, watching the rosemary bush shiver in a breeze I couldn't feel from inside. There's a steadiness to things that grow quietly, year after year. If you pay attention, you can borrow some of that calm when your own world starts shaking. I needed that steadiness now. I pulled out a fresh legal pad and made a new list, 3 columns this time instead of 2. What they know, what they don't know, what I want them to think. That third column was the key. Revenge isn't an explosion, it's a thermostat. You adjust the temperature slowly and let everyone else mistake the heat for comfort while you maintain perfect control. My first call after Maria wasn't to Trevor or Diana. It was to a number in my old Rolodex that I hadn't dialed in more than a decade. Peter Alvarez, Estates and Trusts. He'd handled a delicate situation years back when Catherine's aunt died and a distant cousin suddenly appeared with strong opinions about the will. Peter had a manner I trusted, unfussy, precise, allergic to drama. "Richard," he said when his assistant put me through, "I'm so sorry about Catherine. Can you come in this afternoon? Bring whatever she left for you to find." I could hear the soft click of him opening his appointment book. That sound made me feel steadier than the coffee had. I gathered the blue folder into an old leather messenger bag, locked Catherine's study, and put on a proper shirt for the first time since the funeral. Grief makes sweatpants feel like armor, but armor has its place and time. Today, I wanted to look like a man who still signed documents with a steady hand. Peter's office occupied a brick building that used to be a bank, back when people put their valuables behind steel instead of in some digital cloud. His receptionist had kind eyes that didn't pry, offered water without being asked. When Peter emerged from his office, he wore the same navy suit I remembered, the one that looked like it had grown on him rather than been purchased. We sat at a conference table the color of aged whiskey. I placed the folder between us and opened it to the page I wanted him to see first. The deed showing the house in my name alone, recorded 4 years ago. "Catherine insisted," I said, feeling my throat tighten slightly. Peter nodded, scanning the document with the thorough attention of a man who'd learned to read between lines. "Well," he said softly, "she did this exactly right." He tapped the margin with his pen. "Quitclaim deed transferring sole ownership to you. Properly recorded, notarized, no liens, no encumbrances. If anyone's promising anyone a sale without your signature, they're selling air." He continued reading. "I remember the trust we set up when Trevor was still trying to grow that ridiculous mustache." A ghost of a smile crossed his face. "We amended it 3 years back, remember? Catherine removed the children as presumptive remainder beneficiaries on the real property. They inherit from your estate if, and only if you decide they should. The only non-probate transfer she arranged without your final say is that small life insurance policy for Jessie." He looked up then, reading my expression. "That one was important to her." "I know," I said. It hurt less than I'd expected to admit it out loud. He held up a hand, the gesture he made when he was about to ask a question that mattered. "Has either child attempted to act on your behalf? Represented themselves as having authority over your affairs?" He didn't need to explain what he meant. Power of attorney games, signatures that smelled like presumption. "Trevor found a buyer," I said, keeping my voice dry as a court transcript. showed up at my door with a letter of intent. Peter's expression shifted to something that wasn't quite a smile, but held the same energy. Good. Then let me be crystal clear about 2 points of law. He counted them off on his fingers like a dealer laying cards. 1. Without a valid, current, specific agency document signed by you, no one can legally bind you to anything. 2. Even if you had executed such an agency, you can revoke it unilaterally at any time. Any third party who proceeds after receiving notice does so at their own peril. He slid a document across the table. This is a template cease and desist letter. We'll customize it with names, realtor, buyer's agent, anyone who sent you paperwork. It states clearly that you haven't authorized any representation and that future communications must be in writing only. I read it quickly, catching more tone than substance. The tone was perfect, not angry, just final. And this, he said, placing a second document behind the first, is a notice of non-representation. It states plainly that you have not authorized any person to act on your behalf regarding the sale of your property, and any claim to the contrary is fraudulent. I'll file copies with the county recorder and send them certified mail. Nobody can claim they didn't get the message. I appreciate this, Peter. The room felt a few degrees cooler, which meant my internal temperature was settling exactly where I wanted it. He closed the deed folder and looked at me with the slight curiosity of a chess player who'd just seen a pawn move that might become something more interesting. Now then, he said, what else is in that folder? Tuscany, I said simply. One eyebrow lifted, not surprise, just the engaged interest of a professional who'd learned that the most unassuming clients often had the most complex situations. I turned to the Florence correspondence, the caretaker's information, and the key taped inside the back cover. I gave him the summary first: cottage in Tuscany, title in Catherine's name, instructions to trust Maria. Then the specifics, the law firm's contact information, and Catherine's handwritten notes that formed a simple directive. Keep private. Use only if necessary. Your life is not a negotiation. Peter leaned forward. Your wife was a very intelligent woman, he said, and I nodded because some truths don't require embellishment. We'll contact the Florence firm on your behalf. Establish your standing as surviving spouse, confirm title, and if necessary, effectuate transfer. He paused, weighing his words. Do you want this property to remain discreet? Yes, I said, quicker than I'd intended. For now. Then we'll set up a holding structure. The Italian council will advise on the right vehicle there. On your side, we can create a revocable trust with a boring name, something that won't ring bells. Title the cottage to the trust once Florence clears everything and keep all correspondence flowing through this office. Address we control. I liked the way he said we. Some words are lifelines thrown across dark water. He made more notes. 2 other items. He held up a finger for each. First, credit freezes for you with all 3 bureaus, lifted only by you personally. Not because I think your children would misuse your information, he added, and we both let that polite lie hang in the air between us. But because strange things happen when word gets around that property is changing hands. Second, we take a look at any accounts in Catherine's name that you weren't aware of. If she intended you to have access, and based on what you've shown me she did, then we move cleanly. Otherwise, we leave them exactly where she left them, by design, and we don't volunteer information that nobody's entitled to receive. Quietly, I said. Quietly, he agreed. When we finished signing the letters, his assistant appeared with pre-addressed envelopes, certified mail stickers already in place. Watching those white rectangles slide across the table felt more satisfying than any speech I could have made to my son. The world loves paperwork. Paperwork loves procedure. When you can't make people decent, you can at least make them careful. Back home, I placed the carbon copies in my desk drawer, not Catherine's anymore, but mine. The distinction mattered. Her folder was the map that had brought me here. My drawer was what I chose to do with the destination. The afternoon brought a voicemail from Trevor. Dad, call me back. Don't do anything rash. We're trying to make this easy. That word again, easy, as if comfort were something that could be used as a leash. I let it sit unreturned. A text from Diana followed an hour later. Dinner Tuesday? Can bring takeout. You love that lemon chicken from Chen's garden. I typed, sounds good, and didn't send it. Then I typed it again and did. You don't win by being predictable. You win by controlling the clock. I drove to the post office before closing and rented a P.O. box, medium size, with an extra key. There's preparation that looks like paranoia, and preparation that looks like planning. The difference is usually obvious only in retrospect. The post office box key sat warm in my pocket as I walked back to my truck, a small click of metal that translated in my mind as options. On the way home, I stopped at the cemetery. I hadn't been back since we put Catherine in the ground. It hadn't felt like a place where I could get anything accomplished, but there are conversations you can't have anywhere else. I parked under the old maple and walked to her grave carrying nothing. Her name on the stone still surprised me, the way your reflection in an unexpected mirror catches you off guard. I stood there in my good shirt and said nothing for a long time, letting the wind move through the flags in the veterans section like quiet applause for people who'd shown up when it mattered. When I finally spoke, it wasn't eloquent. They think I'm soft, I said to the carved granite. They think grief made me manageable. The winter air didn't answer, but the ground felt solid beneath my feet. You did the hard part, I added more softly. Now I'll handle the rest. Monday morning brought the first certified mail receipts hitting my phone's tracking app, one by one. Broker, buyer's agent, county recorder, a domino line of green check marks that had nothing poetic about them and still felt like poetry. 2 hours later, an unfamiliar number called. I let it go to voicemail. Mr. Hale, this is Greg from Hawthorne Realty. There seems to be some confusion about your property listing. Your son indicated you were interested in... I stopped the playback there. He'd already said the only part that mattered. I returned the call after lunch and put him on speaker, setting my phone on the counter where I could see the little red recording dot, because someday you always wish you had documentation. Mr. Hawthorne, I said, there's no confusion. I own my home outright. Any further contact regarding listing or sale must go through my attorney in writing. You have his address. Do not come to my property again. Do not discuss my affairs with my children. He tried to sound conciliatory, but words pressed into service of presumption carry a particular smell. Of course, we only want what's best for my client, I corrected. Good day. I sent the audio file to Peter's office with a subject line so mundane it could have been a traffic report. He replied 12 minutes later. Perfect. Logged. There's a strange relief in having your life translated into administrative language. It makes everything feel manageable, procedural, clean. Maria and I spoke that afternoon. Her English carried a musical quality that made me smile despite everything, and when she laughed, her voice did a little skip on the second syllable that reminded me of Catherine's delight when she discovered something unexpected. You're Catherine, Maria said. She saved my life once. I didn't ask how. Not yet. The people who deserve your trust will tell you their stories when the timing is right. The cottage is ready, she added. Fresh linens, lemons in the bowl on the kitchen table. You come when you're ready and you will sleep properly for the first time in months. Sleep felt like a luxury I'd been rationing since Catherine died, stealing it in small portions when exhaustion overwhelmed grief. Soon, I said. I need about a week to arrange things here. I will wait, she said. Tuscany waits very well. After we hung up, I opened my laptop and bought a plane ticket to Rome with a connection through Frankfurt. One way, fully refundable, purchased with a credit card Catherine had labeled in our budget spreadsheet as travel, if we dare. I used the P.O. box for billing and printed nothing at home. I took the precaution of turning off location sharing on my phone, remembering how surprised I'd been when helping Jessie set up her gaming console to discover how eager these devices are to broadcast our whereabouts. I wasn't hiding. I was simply declining to be found by people who hadn't asked permission to look. I spent that evening walking through our house with a notebook, not to inventory possessions, but to listen to what they had to say. Objects speak if you let them. The framed photo of Trevor at 12, gap-toothed in his Little League uniform, spoke of potential that had gotten confused with entitlement. Diana's college pottery spoke of talent abandoned when praise became more important than the clay itself. Jessie's crayon drawing of our garden spoke of a future I was still willing to invest in. I put sticky notes on boxes in the hall closet, not because I planned to ship anything yet, but because it calmed something in me to see my own handwriting giving instructions. To Diana, careful. To Jessie, later. To Trevor, his choice. Tuesday morning, the doorbell rang at 9:03. Through the peephole, the realtor again, accompanied by an older man who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. I opened the door only as wide as the security chain allowed. "Certified letters mean we don't need to do this dance," I said. The older man raised his hands peacefully. "I'm your son's attorney. He asked me to check on your welfare." The word welfare made my jaw clench. "Check from there," I said, not releasing the chain. "You received my counsel's notice yesterday." The realtor tried to be genial. "We thought perhaps you hadn't fully understood." "I understand fine," I said. "When you're 68 and still competent, there's particular satisfaction in saying that without heat. You may leave a card." They did, and I let those business cards sit on the console table like two moths. Harmless unless you forget they eat through fabric when you're not watching. At noon, Trevor called. I answered this time. It felt like a day for letting things reveal themselves. "Dad, what the hell are you doing?" No greeting, just accusation. "Different question," I said. "Better grammar." "Greg says you threatened legal action." "I promised it," I said. "Different verb." "You're being ridiculous," he snapped. "This buyer is legitimate. The offer is generous. We're trying to—" "Who is we?" I asked quietly. He inhaled sharply. "Diana and I. Our families. You know what I mean." "I do," I said. "And that's the problem." Silence stretched between us, filled with the weight of all the conversations we should have had years ago, but never did. "If you insist on making this difficult," he said finally, his voice dropping to something colder, "we'll have to look at other options. Conservatorship is a real thing, Dad, for situations exactly like this." The words slid into our conversation like a piece of glass in soup. I didn't let it cut me. "That's a serious accusation," I said, keeping my tone level. "Are you claiming I lack capacity?" "I'm saying," he replied, softer now but no less threatening, "that we can't just sit around waiting for you to start making dangerous mistakes." "I just made one," I said. "I answered this call." I hung up before he could respond, because bullies prefer schedules only when they think they might get something out of them. When the line went quiet, I walked to my desk and opened the drawer where I'd placed the blue folder. I took out the smallest envelope I hadn't opened yet, the one Catherine had labeled Independence, in her careful handwriting. Inside was a debit card and a typed slip with a pin, along with a handwritten note. "You hate allowances. Consider this a dare rather than a gift. Use it to build a life, not buy time." The audacity of her faith in me made my eyes sting. I set the card on the desk where the light could catch it, a reminder that I still had choices to make. That evening, I changed the deadbolt on the front door, not because I was afraid, because I liked the feeling of a key that answered only to me. I oiled the hinges, tightened screws in the banister, replaced batteries in smoke detectors. Work that seems small until the night when it matters most. When the house settled into the quiet that follows honest labor, I poured a finger of the scotch I'd been saving for a celebration I hadn't defined yet, and sat at the kitchen table with nothing spread in front of me. The absence of paperwork felt like a choice. Sleep came cleanly for the first time in weeks. I woke just before 6 to a text from a Lisbon number. Senor Hale, we have prepared documents establishing you as sole heir to the property. Please confirm when you are ready to receive courier. It was signed with a name I didn't recognize from the letterhead. Paper moving through the world on my behalf while I slept. There are worse lullabies. I took a walk around the block without a coat, breathing mist like a man testing new lungs. My neighbor Joyce waved from her porch and asked after me in a way that didn't require answers. When I reached my front steps again, a small package waited against the door. No return address, just my name and Trevor's impatient handwriting. Inside, a glossy brochure from a senior living community. Smiling gray-haired people by a pool, a list of amenities and cheerful bullet points. Granite countertops, yoga studio, shuttle service to shopping. A note on top. Thought you'd like to look. Love. T. I smiled without warmth and used the brochure to level a wobble in the kitchen table. Useful after all. Thursday arrived with overcast skies the color of old pewter. Peter came 5 minutes early, which is to say, precisely on time. We sat at the same kitchen table where my children had informed me that my life no longer fit properly. He placed a yellow legal pad on the wood and wrote the date at the top with a pen that made satisfying sounds. When Trevor arrived with the man he'd introduced as our attorney, Jeff, Diana followed a step behind, her eyes bright with exhaustion. Jessie wasn't with them. I felt her absence like a lamp that had been switched off. We didn't shake hands. Jeff opened with the voice of someone who'd made partner by being the most reasonable person in unreasonable rooms. We're here in good faith, he said, spreading his hands as if possibility sat on an invisible table between us, to discuss a path forward that honors everyone's interests. Peter slid the cease and desist letter across the very real table in front of us. My client's interests are honored when his property rights are respected, he said evenly. This correspondence restates what your letter yesterday acknowledged. He has not listed his home for sale, has not authorized any person to solicit buyers, and any further efforts to do so will constitute tortious interference. You will be named as defendants. Trevor's jaw worked like he was chewing something bitter. Diana attempted a smile that felt more like a muscle spasm. Dad, we're just trying to think long-term, she said. Me too, I replied. I started thinking long-term before you learned to drive. She flushed. Trevor couldn't contain himself anymore. Look, he said, leaning forward with his palms flat on the table. You keep the house if that's what you want, but you can't expect us to carry... Carry what? I asked gently. He looked surprised by his own words. The burden, he said, smaller now. The burden of my life? I asked, still gentle. The burden of my bills, which you don't pay? The burden of my choices, which you don't make? Or the burden of not getting what you'd already counted as yours? He looked at Jeff as if the law might save him from language. It couldn't. Peter spoke into the quiet. There's also the matter of threats of conservatorship. He didn't look at Trevor when he said it, which made the words ring louder in the room. Those statements were recorded and preserved. Should any petition be filed, we will introduce evidence of competency alongside evidence of attempted financial coercion. Diana's hand flew to her mouth. We would never. She stopped, hearing herself contradict what we all knew had happened. I meant, Trevor said, his eyes hot with frustration, that I'm tired of this. You're tired, I said, nodding as if this were valuable information. I understand. Being told no is exhausting when you've spent months rehearsing yes. We let the silence sit at the table for a full minute. Then I pushed a sheet of paper across to them, not what they'd expected, but a simple list written in my neat block letters. Here's what I'm doing, on my timeline. It read, 3 items. 1. I am not selling my home. 2. If I choose to relocate at any point, I will inform you after the decision is made. 3. I will continue supporting Jessie directly at my discretion. Any attempt to interfere with that support ends all support. Diana's eyes filled with tears that looked real. "Dad," she whispered. "Please." "I am not the enemy," I said, feeling the truth of it in my bones. "But I am not a resource to be managed." Peter collected his pad. Jeff murmured something diplomatic about needing time to digest. Trevor stood without looking at me and moved toward the door as if the house itself had insulted him. Diana lingered. At the threshold, she turned back. "Do you have to be so cold?" "I don't have to be," I said. "I choose to be clear." 3 minutes after they left, my phone buzzed. A Portuguese number. I stepped into Catherine's study and closed the door before answering. "Senor Hale?" the voice said, friendly, precise. "We have courier documents to your postbox. They include confirmation of your status and temporary authorization for the caretaker to act on your instruction." He paused. "We also included information your wife asked us to give you only when you were ready. She was very careful." "Thank you," I said. My voice sounded like a man who knew exactly what he would do next. When I hung up, I stood with my hand on the back of Catherine's chair, my thumb rubbing the place where the leather had worn smooth from years of her leaning into her work. Paper couldn't bring her back. Paper couldn't teach my children what she'd tried to teach them before they decided that wanting was the same as deserving. But paper, when thick enough and stamped by the right offices, could hold a boundary while the rest of me did the quieter work of actually living. On my way to the P.O. box, I passed the senior living development from Trevor's brochure. The sign out front promised maintenance-free living. I laughed, a sound that surprised me. There's no such thing as maintenance-free anything. Either you do the work yourself, or someone else does it to you. I prefer the kind of work that leaves my knuckles scuffed and my name on the deed. The post office smelled like fresh paper and institutional patience. My key turned smoothly in the lock. Inside the box, a yellow slip waited. "Package for pickup." The woman with kind eyes behind the counter handed me a flat envelope heavy enough to change the direction of a day. Portuguese stamps winked up at me like small promises kept. Back in my truck, I opened it carefully. The first document, confirmation in black ink that a small house with terracotta roof and olive trees, somewhere across the Atlantic, was mine in the eyes of two governments to decide about as I saw fit. Underneath, the authorization letter for Maria, her name printed with the kind of official certainty that makes problems solvable. And at the bottom, a note in Catherine's handwriting, a photocopy of a copy, but still unmistakably her voice. "If you're holding this, you are not lost. You are choosing." I put the envelope on the passenger seat where she used to ride and drove home slower than usual, as if speed might shake loose something I wanted to keep safe. In the driveway, I turned off the engine and sat for a moment. The house looked back at me, old, honest, a place that asked for work and paid in dignity. I thought about Tuscany, lemons in a bowl, a terrace where the wind carried news from the sea. I thought about Jesse's drawing and Trevor's clenched jaw and Diana's desperate tears. Then, because a plan is only as good as the next step you take, I picked up my phone and opened a new message to Maria. "Arriving soon. Please prepare the house as you would have for Catherine." I hit send. A second later, "As you wish, Senor. I will set fresh linens and cut lemons from the tree. We will wait for you." Some victories are loud, announced with trumpets and celebrations. Mine would not be. Mine would sound like paper sliding into files, like keys turning in well-oiled locks, like footsteps on ancient stone at dawn. Mine would look like a man in a pressed shirt standing in his doorway with an envelope under his arm, and no intention of asking anyone's permission to live his own life. I carried the envelope inside and set it next to the blue folder on Catherine's desk. Together, they made a shape I recognized, past and future, stacked neatly, with the present balanced perfectly between them. I rested my hand on both folders and let the house settle into quiet around me. It wasn't empty silence. It was the kind that waits for the next movement in a symphony you're finally ready to conduct yourself. The evening before my departure, I sat in Catherine's study with both folders spread across her desk like a map of two different countries. The blue one had brought me to this moment, The manila one would carry me through what came next. I'd spent the afternoon making lists, not the desperate kind grief produces, but the methodical inventories of a man who'd learned the difference between leaving and being driven out. What stays was surprisingly short. The piano. Catherine never learned to play but loved to polish. The books with her marginalia like breadcrumbs through a forest of ideas. The kitchen table where we'd mapped out 28 years of dreams and disappointments and small triumphs. What goes looked like evidence from a trial. Trevor's Italian leather shoes from the decade when he thought expensive things could do the work of consistent character. Diana's knife set, borrowed for one Thanksgiving and somehow never returned. The accumulated sediment of two people who'd learned to mistake access for affection. What travels was the most honest list I'd made in months. Catherine's photograph from our anniversary trip to the coast, one suitcase, and the debit card she'd called a dare. At 9 o'clock I called Jessie. She answered on the second ring, her voice bright with the particular energy of someone who'd been expecting good news. "Grandpa, Mom said you had a meeting with Dad and Uncle Trevor today. How did it go?" I chose my words carefully. It went exactly as it needed to go. That sounds mysterious. I could hear her smile through the phone. "Are you being cryptic on purpose?" "I'm being precise," I said. "There's a difference. Jessie, I need to tell you something, and I need you to listen with your whole heart, not just your ears." The quality of her attention changed immediately. She'd always been able to shift gears like that, even as a little girl, from laughter to seriousness in the space between heartbeats. "The money I've been sending you every month, $500 for 2 years, your mother asked me not to tell you it was from me." Silence. Then, so quietly I almost missed it. "What money?" My chest tightened. "Your college account, sweetie? The one that ends in 3842. "Grandpa," her voice cracked. "I thought, Mom told me that was them helping with school. I thought they were—" She stopped, unable to finish the sentence. "Taking credit," I said gently, "because sometimes you have to name the thing that's eating everyone's oxygen." She started crying. Not the dramatic kind that performs grief, but the quiet kind that leaks out when a story you've been living suddenly rewrites itself. "I wrote them thank you cards," she whispered. "Every semester. I thought they were sacrificing to help me." "They were sacrificing," I said. "They were sacrificing honesty." We sat with that for a moment, the distance between us crackling with everything that couldn't be unsaid. "Grandpa, are you okay? Really okay?" "I'm better than okay," I said, and realized I meant it. "I'm awake." "What does that mean?" "It means I'm about to do something your grandmother taught me how to do." "Which is?" "Choose my own ending." After we hung up, I wrote 3 letters by hand. The first was to Peter, authorizing him to handle all communications from my children's legal counsel and to proceed with the trust arrangements we discussed. The second was to Joyce next door, thanking her for years of quiet kindness and asking her to keep an eye on the house while I was away. Away was specific enough for now. The third letter was the hardest to write, because it was addressed to my children but wouldn't be delivered until they'd earned the right to read it. Trevor and Diana. By the time you read this, I will be living somewhere else. Not because I'm running away, but because I'm running toward something your mother spent months helping me find. You thought grief made me vulnerable. You were right. It made me vulnerable to the truth. The truth is that love isn't supposed to feel like management, care isn't supposed to sound like calculation, and family isn't supposed to be a business where some people are assets and others are liabilities. I hope someday you'll understand that the thing you wanted to take from me, this house, this independence, this right to make my own mistakes, was the thing I most needed to keep. Not the building itself, but what it represents. The radical idea that a man can belong to himself, even when the people who love him think they know better. There's a trust fund for Jessie's education. It will pay for whatever she needs as long as she needs it for learning and growing, not for rescuing either of you from the consequences of your choices. When you're ready to love me without trying to save me, You know how to reach me. Dad. I sealed it in an envelope and placed it in the safe behind our bookshelf, next to Catherine's jewelry and the spare key to the house. Someday, when they were mature enough to read it without anger clouding their comprehension, I'd decide whether they'd earned that conversation. My flight left at 11:35 the next morning. I packed as if I were going away for a weekend that might last the rest of my life. Which, in a way, I was. The suitcase felt lighter than it should have, containing as it did everything I'd decided I needed to be myself in a different country. At dawn, I stood in our garden one last time, breathing the scent of rosemary and listening to the mockingbird that had been Catherine's favorite alarm clock. The lemon tree still needed pruning. Someone else would have to decide whether that mattered. I left the house key with Joyce, along with a note explaining that I'd be traveling indefinitely and that she should feel free to use the garden if she wanted fresh herbs. I didn't mention Trevor and Diana. If they wanted to know where I was, they could practice asking nicely. The drive to the airport felt like a prayer I'd been rehearsing for months without realizing it. Every mile put more distance between me and the version of myself that had sat in that kitchen 3 months ago, too stunned by grief to see the shapes my children were drawing around my life. At the departure gate, I turned my American phone to airplane mode and left it that way. Some conversations require you to be completely present where you are, not divided between where you've been and where you're going. When they called for boarding, I walked down the jet bridge carrying nothing but my single suitcase and Catherine's dare. Behind me, an entire life I'd spent decades building. Ahead of me, a country I'd never seen and a woman named Maria who owed my wife her life and was prepared to help me reclaim mine. The plane lifted off with the kind of certainty that only comes from having a destination. As the familiar landscape fell away beneath the clouds, I thought about the last thing Catherine had said to me before the morphine claimed her final words. Don't let them make you smaller than you are. I hadn't understood then that she wasn't talking about death. She was talking about how to live. Rome's airport arrived beneath us like a promise kept in stone and light. The runway met the wheels with the solid thump of one certainty greeting another. I'd crossed something invisible during those hours over the Atlantic, not just an ocean, but a threshold between the life I'd been assigned and the one I was finally ready to claim. Customs was a line of people practicing patience in different languages. When my turn came, the officer, a young man with ancient eyes, stamped my passport with the kind of authority that only comes from representing something older than yourself. Benvenuto, he said, and the word felt like a door opening. Outside the sliding glass doors, the Italian air had the temperature of possibility, cool enough to wake you up, warm enough to promise better days ahead. I looked for Maria among the crowd of people holding signs with names I couldn't pronounce. She found me first. A compact woman with silver-streaked hair pulled into a practical knot, wearing a navy sweater that didn't announce itself, but somehow made everything around it look more organized. When our eyes met, her whole face changed, not a smile exactly, but the return of something she'd been carefully saving. "Senior Hale," she said, stepping forward with the confidence of someone who'd been expecting exactly this moment for months. "Maria," I said. And she did something that surprised me. She hugged me, quick and firm, as if it would have been rude not to. "Your Catherine," she said when she stepped back, "would be very angry with me if I did not welcome you properly." Angry, and then later she would say it was perfect. Exactly right. The way she spoke about Catherine, present tense wrapped in past experience, made something tight in my chest finally relax. "She'd pretend to scold," I said, and then make it sound like a prayer when she told the story later. Maria nodded as if she'd been in our kitchen for those small liturgies. "Come," she said, gesturing toward a small car the color of Mediterranean sky. We go home. The drive from Rome to Tuscany unrolled like a letter I'd been waiting my whole life to read. Hills that knew how to hold their secrets, villages that had learned to age gracefully, their stone walls weathered into the landscape like good advice. Maria narrated when narration mattered, pointing out landmarks with the economy of someone who understood that too many words could spoil the view. There, she said at one roundabout. Best bread in 3 provinces. At another, Pharmacia, but you will not need. The air here knows how to heal. When we left the main highway for roads that demanded attention rather than speed, she slowed down. Olive trees, she said, as if introducing me to relatives I should meet properly. The old ones remember when Romans planted them. They remember everything. We turned into a lane marked by stone walls, the height of good boundaries, their tops crowned with climbing roses that had learned to bloom in defiance of seasons. The car stopped in front of a house that looked like it had grown from the hillside rather than been built on it. Honey-colored stone walls, shutters painted the blue of summer evenings, a terracotta roof that curved like cupped hands. Home, Maria said simply, and the word carried the weight of absolute certainty. I stood looking at the cottage for several seconds before I could find my voice. It wasn't large, maybe half the size of the house I'd left behind, but it had something my American home had lost in the battles of the last few months. It had peace. Not the silence of emptiness, but the quiet of a place that knew exactly what it was supposed to be. Maria took a brass key from her sweater pocket and placed it in my palm with the ceremony of a benediction. The metal was warm, substantial, perfectly weighted for the lock it had been born to open. This is yours, she said, in law, and in what matters more than law. Inside, the rooms opened to each other with the easy confidence of a house that had been designed for living rather than impressing. Terracotta tiles under my feet, their surface worn smooth by centuries of footsteps. A fireplace built for conversation, not display. Windows positioned to catch light at the hours when light mattered most. The kitchen made me understand why Italians talked with their hands. Every surface invited touch, participation, the kind of cooking that was more conversation than technique. Copper pots hung from wrought iron hooks like musical instruments waiting for the right melody. A wooden table scarred with the honest history of meals shared and stories told. And on the counter, exactly as promised, a blue ceramic bowl filled with lemons so perfect they looked like they'd been painted by someone who understood that God was in the details. Maria moved through the rooms with the quiet choreography of a caretaker who cared not just about the house but about what it meant to the person who would live in it. Linens, she said, opening a closet that smelled like sunshine and lavender. All fresh, changed yesterday. She touched the edge of a bed that looked like it had been waiting patiently for someone to remember how to sleep peacefully. New mattress, she added, from Florence. Very good for backs that have carried too much. At the back of the house, French doors opened onto a terrace that looked out over a valley, where the afternoon light was conducting a symphony in gold and green. Stone underfoot, iron railings painted that perfect Italian blue, and beyond the balustrade the kind of view that made you understand why people wrote poetry about landscapes they might never see again. I stood there and let it wash over me, not just the beauty, but the rightness of it. This was what Catherine had seen in her mind when she'd signed those papers, when she'd arranged for Maria's care, when she'd written that note about trusting someone who owed her a life. The papers from Firenze, Maria said, appearing beside me with an envelope that felt official and important. Everything as your wife arranged. The house is yours, properly recorded. I am authorized as caretaker to call electricians and masons and to pay them without bothering you about every small decision. She handed me the envelope and a pen. Sign where the arrows point. Italian bureaucracy loves arrows. I signed my name with a hand that had forgotten how to hesitate. Each signature felt less like claiming something and more like finally admitting what had been true for longer than I'd known. Now, Maria said, collecting the papers with the satisfaction of someone who appreciated completed tasks. You eat, then you sleep. In that order, or the house will not trust you. She disappeared into the kitchen and returned with a plate that made me realize I hadn't eaten properly in months. Bread that didn't apologize for its honesty, olive oil that tasted like concentrated sunlight, cheese that had aged with more dignity than most people manage. Simple things, prepared by hands that understood simplicity, was not the same as easy. I ate standing at the terrace railing, watching the light change colors as it slid down the valley walls. Somewhere in the distance, church bells marked an hour that felt completely unrelated to the clock I'd been living by for the past 40 years. "Your wife," Maria said when I'd finished eating, "told me you would ask about the story, about why I owe her my life." I looked at her, this compact woman with steady hands and eyes that had seen enough of the world to know the difference between drama and genuine crisis. "She was right," I said, "but only when you're ready to tell it." Maria smiled, the first full smile I'd seen from her, warm and slightly crooked in a way that made it completely trustworthy. "Tomorrow," she said. "After you sleep in a bed that does not know your grief. After you wake up in a place where you are not anyone's problem to solve." That night, I slept for 10 hours straight, the kind of sleep that happens when your body finally believes it's safe to let go completely. I woke to sunlight streaming through windows I didn't recognize for a blessed moment, in a room that smelled like lavender and possibility. For the first time in months, I'd dreamed about something other than Catherine's funeral. I'd dreamed about mornings that didn't begin with obligation, and evenings that ended with contentment rather than exhaustion. When I finally made my way to the kitchen, I found that Maria had left a thermos of coffee on the counter with a note. "Gone to market. Back with lunch ingredients. Explore the village if you like. Everyone knows you are Catherine's husband. They will be kind." I poured the coffee into a ceramic mug that felt perfect in my hands and walked out onto the terrace. The valley spread below me like a letter written in green ink on golden paper. Somewhere in the distance, I could hear the sound of someone working in a garden, not the mechanical noise of American lawn care, but the rhythmic, unhurried sounds of hands that enjoyed their work. I thought about Trevor and Diana waking up in their respective homes, probably already wondering if they should drive by the house to check on their stubborn father. I imagined their confusion when they found Joyce collecting mail and watering the herbs, their growing frustration as they realized I'd simply left, without asking permission, without providing a forwarding address, without making it easy for them to continue the conversation on their terms. The thought should have made me feel guilty. Instead, it made me feel something I hadn't experienced in years, the pure, clean satisfaction of a well-executed plan. I raised my coffee mug to the Tuscan morning and said quietly, "Thank you, Catherine." Somewhere in the valley, those church bells rang again, and this time they sounded like applause. 3 months into my Italian life, I received the call I'd been expecting. Not from Trevor or Diana. They were still trying to locate me through Peter's office, a process he was handling with the bureaucratic creativity of a man who genuinely enjoyed making entitled people wait. The call came from Jesse. I was sitting on my terrace in the golden hour before sunset, a glass of wine that Maria had insisted would help me understand the local philosophy balanced on the stone railing beside me. When my Italian phone buzzed with an international number I recognized, I felt my pulse quicken with something that wasn't quite anxiety and wasn't quite anticipation. "Grandpa." Her voice came through clear despite the distance, carrying emotions I could hear but not quite name yet. "Hello, sweetheart," I said, setting down my wine glass. "How did you get this number?" "Jesse methods," she said, and I could hear the smile in her voice. "Also, your lawyer is nicer than Dad thinks he is." I laughed despite myself. "Peter's developing a soft spot for you." "Grandpa, where are you?" It was the question I'd been preparing to answer for months, but now that it had arrived, I found myself hesitating. Not because I didn't trust her, but because I wanted to get it right. Some conversations change everything, and you only get one chance to set the tone. "I'm in Tuscany," I said finally. "In a house your grandmother left me." Silence. Then, "Grandma left you a house in Italy?" "She left me an option," I corrected. "I chose to take it." Another pause, longer this time. When Jessie spoke again, her voice carried a weight I'd never heard there before. Not the weight of burden, but the weight of someone who was finally ready to hear complicated truths. "Mom and Dad are losing their minds," she said. They've been calling everyone. Your neighbors, your doctors, even people from church. Dad hired a private investigator. To find a man who's committed no crime and owes no one an explanation, I said mildly. That seems expensive. Grandpa, her voice cracked slightly. Are you ever coming back? The question hung in the air between us, carried across continents by technology that still felt like magic even when you understood the science behind it. I looked out at the valley where Maria was probably preparing dinner with the same careful attention she brought to everything that mattered. I don't know, I said, and it was the most honest answer I could give. This feels like home in a way I'd forgotten was possible. What about us? She asked, and there was something in her voice. Not accusation, but genuine curiosity. What about family?
What about it? I asked gently. You're still my granddaughter whether I'm in Ohio or Italy. Your parents are still my children whether they approve of my choices or not. Geography doesn't change love, Jessie. It just changes proximity. She was quiet for so long I thought the connection had dropped. Then, can I come visit? The question hit me like a small explosion of joy. When? Summer break. I could stay for a month, maybe longer. I've been taking Italian classes and there's this program in Florence. She was speaking faster now, words tumbling over each other with excitement. I know it's presumptuous, and I should have asked first, but I already looked into flights and… Yes, I said, interrupting her beautiful spiral of nervous planning. Absolutely yes. Maria will be delighted. She's been asking when she'll meet the famous granddaughter. Who's Maria? The woman who saved my life by helping me remember how to live it. After we hung up, I sat on the terrace until the stars came out, thinking about the strange arithmetic of family. How love divided by distance could sometimes result in greater intimacy. How the people who claim to know what's best for you are often the ones who know you least. How sometimes the kindest thing you can do for the people you love is to stop letting them shrink you down to the size of their expectations. The next morning I called Peter. Richard, he said, and I could hear the smile in his voice. How's the Italian adventure treating you? Like medicine I didn't know I needed, I said. What's the status on the home front? Trevor's attorney has been making increasingly frantic inquiries about your whereabouts. I've been responding with the legal equivalent of, I'll ask him and get back to you. It's become something of a sport. I laughed. And the house? Joyce is taking excellent care of it. She sends photos every week. The garden looks better than it has in years. Apparently, she has a gift for roses. And the trust for Jessie? Funded and earning modest returns, she'll have everything she needs for college and graduate school with enough left over for whatever comes next. The quarterly statements go to the P.O. box. Perfect. One more thing, Peter. I want to write a new will. Comprehensive revision? Complete rewrite. The house goes to Jessie when she turns 30, with Joyce having life estate until then if she wants it. The Italian property stays with me, then goes to Jessie as well. Trevor and Diana get exactly what they've earned, which is a thorough understanding that love is not an inheritance. That afternoon, Maria and I drove to Florence so I could sign the documents at the American consulate. The city rose around us like a prayer made of stone and light. Every bridge and dome a testament to what humans could accomplish when they remembered they were more than the sum of their immediate needs. Your wife would be proud, Maria said, as we walked along the Arno after the paperwork was finished. How can you be sure? Because she knew you would find your way here eventually. She prepared everything, but she could not make you choose. That part you had to do yourself. We stopped at a cafe where the espresso came in cups small enough to demand attention and strong enough to rewrite your understanding of what coffee could be. Maria stirred sugar into hers with the meditative focus of someone who had learned to find significance in small rituals. You asked about the story, she said finally. About why I owe Catherine my life. I waited, having learned from living with Catherine that some stories can't be hurried. I was 22, Maria began. Married to a man who seemed kind until the papers were signed. Then he became something else. Cruel. Violent.
When I tried to leave, I discovered he had put debts in my name, legal troubles that would follow me everywhere. She paused to sip her espresso, using the gesture to gather strength for the harder parts of the story. I was working at a cafe near the American Embassy. Your wife came in one morning. This was maybe 15 years ago. And she saw me crying over a letter from a lawyer. She sat down and asked if I needed help. Not in that way foreigners sometimes do, like they're collecting stories to tell at dinner parties. She asked like someone who genuinely cared about the answer. That sounds like her, I said. When I explained my situation, she didn't offer money. She offered something better, knowledge. She knew lawyers in Florence, good ones who worked with women in my position. She came with me to every appointment, took notes when my English wasn't good enough for legal language, made sure I understood every document before I signed it. Maria's eyes were bright with memory now, not tears. It took 2 years to untangle everything my husband had created. Catherine never missed an appointment. When my mother got sick, Catherine brought soup and sat with her so I could work. When the final papers were signed and I was free, Catherine hugged me and said, "Now you know how strong you are, don't ever forget." "And you've been taking care of this house ever since?" She asked me to keep it ready for when you might need it. I said yes, because she had taught me that when someone saves your life, you spend the rest of it looking for ways to return the favor. We finished our coffee in comfortable silence, watching tourists photograph each other in front of bridges that had been holding up the world for centuries. I thought about Catherine in those final months, planning my escape route while I focused on doctor appointments and insurance claims and the exhausting logistics of dying. She'd been building me a bridge to the rest of my life while I was still learning how to say goodbye to the life we'd shared. "Maria," I said as we walked back toward her car, "do you think she knew how this would turn out? With my children? With me ending up here?" Maria considered this seriously. "I think she knew you were stronger than you remembered being. And I think she knew that sometimes the people who love us most are the ones who make us smallest, not because they mean to, but because fear makes them want to keep us safe in boxes we've outgrown." That evening I wrote letters. One to Joyce, thanking her for caring for our garden and offering her the life estate Peter had explained. One to Peter, expressing gratitude for his discretion and his skill at turning legal language into a form of protection. And one more. This one to be delivered only if and when Trevor and Diana proved they were ready to receive it without turning it into ammunition for their anger. But first, I wrote to Jessie, telling her about the trust fund and the houses that would someday be hers, explaining that wealth was like any other tool, dangerous in the wrong hands, powerful when wielded with wisdom. "The money is not an apology for their behavior," I wrote, "and it's not a reward for yours. It's simply what your grandmother and I built together, passing to the next generation of our family that understands the difference between having things and being had by them. Your parents will have opportunities to earn forgiveness, but they will have to earn it. Love is not the same as trust, and trust is not the same as access to your life. You get to decide who deserves what and when and why. Use your freedom wisely. Use your education completely. Use your inheritance as fuel for becoming whoever you're meant to be, not as insurance against ever having to find out." As I sealed the envelope, I thought about the chain of decisions that had brought me to this terrace, to this moment, to this understanding of what it meant to live deliberately instead of defensively. Catherine's illness had been the catalyst, but my children's behavior had been the accelerant. Without their grasping, their presumption, their inability to see me as anything other than a problem to be managed, I might never have discovered that I still had choices to make. In trying to diminish me, they had forced me to remember my own magnitude. The irony was delicious, and I savored it like the wine Maria had left on the counter with a note. For celebrating small victories that turn out to be large ones. I poured myself a glass and raised it to the Tuscan sky, where the first stars were beginning to appear like pinpricks of light and velvet. "Salute," I said to the night air, to Catherine's memory, to the version of myself that had been brave enough to sign his name on documents written in a foreign language in service of a life he'd never imagined he deserved. From somewhere in the valley came the sound of laughter, carried on the evening breeze like a blessing I didn't have to earn. Jessie's plane touched down in Rome on a Tuesday morning that felt like the first page of a story we'd been waiting to write together. I watched her emerge from customs with the confidence of someone who'd spent months preparing for this adventure. Not just learning the language, but learning how to be the kind of person who could navigate foreign countries and unfamiliar situations with grace. She'd grown taller since I'd last seen her, or maybe I'd just forgotten how to see her without the filter of family drama. Her hair was longer, pulled back in a way that showed off cheekbones that reminded me of Catherine at that age. But it was her eyes that had changed the most. They held a steadiness I didn't remember from Christmas visits and birthday dinners, the kind of clarity that comes from having hard conversations and surviving them. "No," she called out when she spotted me, using the Italian word with an accent that was nearly perfect. She ran the last few steps and hugged me with the enthusiasm of someone who'd been storing up affection for months. "When did you get so tall?" I asked, holding her at arm's length to get a proper look. "When did you get so Italian?" she countered, laughing. "You look, I don't know, younger, happier, something." "All of the above," I said, taking her backpack. "Come on, Maria's made enough food to feed half of Tuscany in your honor." The drive from Rome gave us time to catch up on everything that couldn't be conveyed in our weekly phone calls. Jessie told me about her Italian classes, her plans to spend a semester in Florence studying art history, her growing frustration with her parents' continued inability to understand why I'd left. "Dad keeps saying you're having a midlife crisis," she said, watching the countryside roll past the car window. I told him that midlife crises involve buying sports cars and dating inappropriately young women, not moving to Italy to live quietly and grow vegetables. How did he respond to that? He said I was being disrespectful. She turned to look at me. I said I was being accurate. I smiled, recognizing Catherine's precision in her granddaughter's words. "And your mother?" "Mom's complicated. She cries a lot. She keeps saying she's sorry, but she can't seem to figure out what she's apologizing for. It's like she knows she did something wrong, but she's hoping if she says sorry enough times, she won't have to identify what it was." "Apologies without accountability are just words," I said. That's what I told her. She didn't like it. We spent the rest of the drive talking about lighter things, Jessie's plans for her month in Italy, the places Maria had already mapped out for us to visit, the cooking lessons that had been promised. But underneath the easy conversation, I could feel the weight of everything that had changed in the months since I'd left Ohio. Not just my circumstances, but my understanding of what family could be when it wasn't defined by guilt and obligation. Maria was waiting in the garden when we arrived, her hands dirty from repotting herbs, her smile wide enough to make the afternoon light seem brighter. She and Jessie took to each other immediately, communicating in a mixture of English, Italian, and the universal language of women who recognized kindness in each other. "Your grandfather," Maria told Jessie over lunch, "has become quite the gardener. The tomatoes worship him. The basil asks for his blessing." "She's exaggerating," I said. "I mostly just water things and try not to kill them." "He is being modest," Maria continued, winking at Jessie. "He talks to the plants. They talk back. Very Italian." That evening, after Maria had gone home and Jessie had unpacked her things in the guest room, we sat on the terrace with glasses of wine and watched the sun paint the valley in shades of gold and amber. The silence between us was comfortable, the kind that comes from being with someone who doesn't need you to perform happiness. "Grandpa," Jessie said finally, "I need to tell you something." I waited, having learned from Catherine that the most important conversations often begin with that exact phrase. "I'm not going back for my senior year. I'm transferring to the University of Florence. I've already been accepted and the credits will transfer." She looked at me sideways, gauging my reaction. "My parents don't know yet." "How do you feel about it?" I asked. "Terrified and excited in equal measure," she said honestly, "but mostly right. It feels right in a way that Ohio hasn't for a while. Then you should do it." She blinked, clearly having expected more resistance. "Just like that?" Just like that. You're 20 years old, Jesse. You're smart, capable, and you've proven you can make good decisions. Why would I waste time trying to talk you out of something that makes you happy? She was quiet for a long moment, swirling wine in her glass and watching the light reflect off the surface. Mom's going to lose her mind. Your mother's mind is not your responsibility to manage. Dad's going to blame you. He'll say you're corrupting me with European ideas about independence. Your father's blame is not your burden to carry. She looked at me then, really looked, as if she was seeing me clearly for the first time. When did you get so wise? When I stopped letting other people's fear dictate my choices, I said. Same thing that's happening to you, I think. We sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to appear, scattered across the Italian sky like seeds of possibility. In the distance, I could hear the sound of life continuing its ancient rhythms, church bells, laughter, the soft murmur of conversations carried on the evening breeze. Grandpa, Jessie said sleepily. Do you miss it? Ohio, I mean. The house, the garden, the way things used to be. I considered the question seriously. Did I miss the familiarity of routines I'd followed for decades? The comfort of knowing exactly where everything belonged? The illusion of permanence that comes from staying in the same place for most of your adult life? I miss your grandmother every day, I said finally. But I don't miss the feeling of being managed by people who think they love me too much to let me make my own mistakes. I don't miss the exhaustion of defending choices I shouldn't have to defend. I don't miss feeling like a problem instead of a person. I think I understand, she said, and she, good. Understanding is the first step toward making sure you never let anyone make you smaller than you are. 3 days later, Jessie called her parents from my terrace, her voice steady and clear as she explained her plans for her final year of college. I didn't stay to listen. Some conversations are meant to be private, but I could hear the rise and fall of her voice through the open doors, the firmness that reminded me of Catherine when she'd made up her mind about something. When she came back inside, she was crying, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were the kind of tears that come from finally saying something you've been carrying around for too long. How did they take it? I asked. About as well as expected. Dad accused you of brainwashing me. Mom asked if I was doing this to punish them. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. I told them I was doing it because it's what I want. They don't seem to understand the difference. They will, I said. Eventually, or they won't. Either way, it's not your job to teach them. That summer passed like the best kind of dream, the kind where you're conscious enough to appreciate what's happening while it's happening. Jessie and I fell into an easy routine, mornings in the garden, afternoons exploring hill towns that had been perfecting the art of living well for centuries, evenings on the terrace talking about everything and nothing. She learned to make Maria's ragu sauce and how to prune olive trees, and how to argue with vendors at the local market in increasingly confident Italian. I learned to see my granddaughter not as an extension of my children, but as herself, funny, thoughtful, occasionally stubborn in the best possible way, and absolutely fearless when it came to claiming the life she wanted. When August ended, and it was time for her to leave for Florence, I drove her to the train station with a mixture of pride and melancholy that reminded me of dropping Catherine off at the airport for her first solo trip to visit her sister. I'll come back for Christmas, Jessie promised as we waited on the platform. I'll be here, I said. Maria will too. She's already planning the menu. She hugged me tight. This remarkable young woman who'd inherited the best parts of her grandmother's courage and her grandfather's stubbornness. Thank you, she whispered. For what? For showing me it's possible to choose your own story, even when everyone else thinks they know how it should end. After the train disappeared around the bend, I drove home through countryside that had become as familiar as my own heartbeat. The cottage welcomed me back with the quiet satisfaction of a place that knew it was loved, not just inhabited. That evening I called Peter to check on the house in Ohio. Joyce was thriving in her new role as caretaker, he reported. The garden had never looked better, and she'd started giving tours to the garden club. Trevor and Diana drove by occasionally, but they no longer stopped. They'd apparently accepted that their father had vanished into thin air and would reappear when and if he chose to. "Any regrets?" Peter asked. I looked out at the valley where the evening light was conducting its nightly symphony, turning ordinary hills into something that belonged in a Renaissance painting. In a few hours, Maria would stop by with fresh bread and whatever gossip she'd collected at the market. Tomorrow I would tend my vegetables and read in the shade of the olive tree, and maybe drive to Florence to visit the museums I was slowly working my way through. "None," I said, and meant it completely. After we hung up, I poured myself a glass of wine and sat on the terrace to watch the stars come out. Somewhere across the Atlantic, Trevor was probably checking his investment portfolio, and Diana was probably planning next week's social calendar, and Jessie was probably reading in her apartment near the Duomo, dreaming of the art history thesis she'd write about the restoration of forgotten frescoes. All of them living their own lives, making their own choices, carrying their own consequences. Exactly as it should be. I raised my glass to the Italian sky, to Catherine's memory, to the chain of small decisions that had led me to this terrace, this moment, this understanding of what it meant to live deliberately instead of defensively. "Salute," I said to the night air, and from somewhere in the darkness, carried on the evening breeze, came the sound of church bells marking another hour in a life I'd finally learned to call my own. Thank you for joining me on this journey. If this story moved you, please share your thoughts in the comments below. Sometimes the most powerful victories are the quietest ones, and sometimes the greatest courage is simply refusing to let others write the ending to your story.